When Air India Flight 171 lifted off from the runway, everything looked normal. A Boeing 787 Dreamliner, clear weather, 2 fully trained pilots. Seconds later, everything changed. The plane nosed over, lost altitude, and slammed into the ground, killing everyone on board. Investigators rushed in, black boxes were pulled from the wreckage, and within hours the blame started to form. Pilot error. But what if I told you that narrative is already falling apart? What if the pilots didn't make a mistake? What if the aircraft stopped listening to them entirely? What if the cockpit recorder captured a sentence so chilling, so subtle, that it rewrites the entire timeline of that crash? Scientists, investigators, and industry experts are now coming forward, reanalyzing the data and finding patterns that are too dangerous to ignore. Software anomalies, electrical glitches, a plane that may have shut itself down midair, and the more they uncover, the clearer it becomes. What really happened to Flight 171 is not what we're being told. It started with just 2 words, exchanged in the cockpit just seconds before disaster. "Why did you cut off?" "I didn't." That short, calm conversation between 2 experienced pilots reveals something deeper than confusion. It suggests that the fuel switches, responsible for keeping both engines alive, moved on their own. On a Boeing 787, that should be impossible. These switches are controlled manually. They're protected by logic systems. No pilot ever expects them to flip without a command. But that's exactly what the voice recorder captured. Both engines shutting down without anyone touching them. Within a minute of takeoff, both engines had lost fuel flow. And this wasn't just an isolated event. It was the climax of a series of malfunctions that had plagued this specific aircraft for years. When the pilots tried to relight the engines, the systems ignored them. When they tried to stabilize the aircraft, the controls gave up. The airplane didn't fail, it refused to cooperate. And what makes this even more disturbing? The pilots weren't confused. They weren't panicking. Every move they made was textbook. Every action matched emergency procedures. But the aircraft's systems had already begun their silent revolt, a revolt that would end in fire. To understand what really happened, we have to rewind the clock. This wasn't just a clean aircraft with a hidden flaw. This was a jet with a paper trail, a known history of software bugs, system failures, and mystery alerts. On December 12, 2024, months before the crash, this very aircraft had to cancel an international flight due to an unresolvable electrical snag, a failure so serious that it couldn't be fixed overnight. In the weeks leading up to the crash, pilots reported more anomalies: false fuel system warnings, broken displays, malfunctioning transducers, sensors critical to pitch control. Even Boeing's own maintenance procedures acknowledged these issues. But just because a checklist is followed doesn't mean a problem is solved. And in this case, it clearly wasn't. The cockpit logs revealed what engineers already feared. This plane had been crying wolf, showing fake errors, triggering ghost alerts. And the danger of a system that lies is that eventually people stop believing it. By the time a real failure appeared, the trust between human and machine had already been compromised. And this time, the machine had the final word. The Boeing 787 relies on a system called FADEC, Full Authority Digital Engine Control. It's the electronic brain behind the engines. It decides how much fuel flows, when to ignite, when to shut down. In normal flight, FADEC makes decisions faster and more accurately than any human can, but only when it's fed the right information. One of the sensors feeding FADEC had already been flagged for failure, a stabilizer position transducer that controls how the system interprets pitch. If that sensor sent bad data, FADEC could have misread the plane's attitude as a critical emergency, even if everything was fine. That could lead to what experts call an uncommanded fuel cutoff, a decision made by software to shut down the engines to protect them. Except this time, there was no threat. There was only corrupted input. FADEC wasn't saving the aircraft. It was killing it. And to make matters worse, the auto relight system, designed to reignite engines in flight, can't activate if the fuel switches are set to cutoff. No fuel, no relight, no chance. It was the worst kind of automation failure, a system acting with perfect logic based on completely flawed information. The plane didn't explode, it didn't break, it simply stopped flying because its brain told it to, As the aircraft lost altitude, another failure happened. One so serious it should have triggered a global alert. The deployment of the RAT, not a rodent, a ram air turbine. It's a tiny wind-powered backup generator that only activates when everything else has failed. When that turbine deploys, it means one thing. The aircraft has lost all, or nearly all, electrical power. This wasn't a momentary glitch. This was a total collapse. The RAT is the last line of defense, providing just enough power to control basic systems. It's not supposed to deploy seconds after takeoff. It's supposed to stay hidden forever. But on Flight 171, it dropped. Fast. The implications are horrifying. If power to the electrical systems failed, the pilots had no control over engine restarts. The relight system is electrical. Fuel flow is electrical. Even communication is electrical. With the RAT deployed, the pilots weren't just fighting a shutdown. They were flying blind, deaf, and nearly powerless. What caused the loss of power? It could have been a massive electrical fault, a software bug cascading through subsystems, a short circuit, or even, as some fear, a combination of failures the aircraft was never tested for. But no matter the cause, one thing is now certain. The crash was not caused by incompetence. It was caused by design. After the crash, the black box became the focus. The flight data recorder showed something damning. Both fuel switches were set to cutoff. For many, that was the smoking gun. Case closed, pilot error. But here's what they didn't say. The black box doesn't show fingers. It doesn't record intent. It logs events, electrical states, switch positions, output values. Not the how, not the why, just the what. Imagine a message was sent from your phone and someone claimed you wrote it. But what if your phone glitched, or someone else touched it? The message is real, but the assumption behind it could be false. That's what's happening here. The switch positions were real, but the assumption that the pilots manually flipped them might be completely wrong. And here's where it gets even more suspicious. These switches didn't just cut off the fuel, they stayed off. That suggests either a total power loss or a system that overrode pilot input. In that moment, the aircraft became a closed loop, listening only to itself. And for the pilots, it was like watching your car accelerate toward a cliff with no way to grab the wheel. Experts believe the crash was triggered not by one failure, but by a cascade. A system spiraling into collapse because of multiple weak points interacting at once. It began with the faulty stabilizer sensor. That bad input may have triggered FADEC to shut down the engines unnecessarily. With the engines off, the aircraft lost power. That forced the RAT to deploy. The emergency turbine powered a few vital systems, but not enough to regain control. And here's the terrifying part. Once the switches were in cutoff, the relight system was disabled. No fuel, no restart, no override. The pilots flipped the switches back to run. They tried restarting the engines. They did everything by the book, but it was too late. Without full electrical power, the systems they depended on had no way to respond. This wasn't just a crash, it was a loop of locked-out logic. Each system, acting rationally on its own, created a network of failure, the kind no checklist could solve. And when engineers tried to replicate it in simulators, they saw the same result. Once the loop began, recovery was nearly impossible. This wasn't the first time this specific aircraft showed signs of deep malfunction. In 2015, it suffered a cabin air compressor surge, forcing an emergency landing. The issue was linked to critical pressure systems, and it was already known within the 787-8 Dreamliner family. That alone should have raised red flags. But it didn't end there. In December 2024, the exact same aircraft canceled an international flight due to an unresolvable electrical fault. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a red alert grounding. And just weeks before the crash, false alerts began appearing on cockpit displays. One of them claimed a fault in the fuel system. Engineers called it a ghost alert. Nothing was wrong until something was. This is what experts call systemic decay, when multiple systems, across years, start to erode trust and function. On their own, each issue seems minor. Together, they form a pattern, a slow unraveling of safety. And it's that pattern that proves Flight 171 didn't die by chance. It died by neglect. In the final seconds of Flight 171, the cockpit voice recorder captured something remarkable. Not confusion, not panic, but calm, clear communication. As the engines shut down, the crew immediately diagnosed the issue. They attempted a relight. They toggled the fuel switches back to run. They followed protocol, step by step, while the aircraft dropped from the sky. They did everything right. And yet nothing worked. Not because they made a mistake, but because the plane had already made up its mind. The systems were no longer responding. The electrical grid was too damaged. The relight system was locked out. The emergency rat was spinning, but powerless to undo the software decisions that had already been made. And that's the most haunting part of all. These pilots didn't freeze. They didn't fail. They fought. And the only reason we know what really happened is because the voice recorder proves it. If we're going to rewrite this story, we need to start by erasing the word pilot error, because the systems that were supposed to save them were the very ones that sealed their fate. Air India Flight 171 didn't fall from the sky because of a mistake. It wasn't caused by pilot error. It wasn't weather. It wasn't sabotage. It was something far more terrifying, something we never want to believe about modern aviation. The plane made a decision that no one could stop. Two trained professionals did everything right. They followed procedures. They reacted quickly. They tried to recover. But the aircraft didn't respond. The fuel shutoff happened without a command. The engines went silent, not by human hand, but by digital logic. The backup systems failed, the warnings were ignored, and a pattern of past malfunctions was never treated as the life-threatening danger it truly was. And yet, even in its final moments, the narrative turned against the very people who tried to save it. The black box recorded what happened, but it didn't record why, so we filled in the blanks with blame. We assumed, we accused, we closed the case. But the truth is clearer than ever now. Scientists, pilots, engineers, they're all pointing to the same thing: a dangerous combination of flawed automation, ignored warning signs, and a culture of deflection. A failure not of one part, but of a system that was never designed to admit when something went wrong. This wasn't just a plane crash, it was a warning. And if we ignore it, if we continue to call this pilot error, we're not just disrespecting the dead, we're inviting the next tragedy. If this video opened your eyes, share it. Because somewhere right now, another aircraft is trusting the same software, using the same sensors, flying with the same assumptions. And if we don't speak up, if we don't ask the hard questions, then one day we'll be here again, watching the same story play out, pretending we didn't see it coming.